My name is Jody Joseph. I think I know many of you. I've painted with a lot of you, and I am absolutely thrilled that you've joined us today for our first, what hopefully will be a series of online talks with amazing artists. And we have one of the most amazing joining us today. And I am very grateful, John Hartman. And you are in for an incredible treat, both visually and also hearing about an amazing career and a person who has, accomplished so much, and also someone I think you'll be able to relate to very well. So this talk is sponsored by the Dundas Valley School of Art, and I'm grateful to them for wanting us to do that. The other thing is, because I'm initiating it and I'm a painter, probably we'll be talking a lot about painting. And I know a lot of you are painters. I just did an informal poll, and many of you are painters or are students of art, students of painting. And so this is a rare and wonderful opportunity to hear from a total expert. The other thing, I wanted this series to be the kind of, when you look at some painting in a book, and John has many books that are out, we'll talk more about that later, and if, many of them are still available for purchase, and you can have one of your own. But when you're standing in front of a painting in which the artists were right there to ask questions, that's the kind of questions I hope to ask in this. And I want to thank again Lisa Jeffries, the staff at DVSA, for helping us on the technical side. All right, I guess I will do a lot of the introduction. Information about John will come from showing the work. Just after a few minutes, I will put up John's work, and you guys will see mainly all of his beautiful paintings and some drawings, and we will talk about that. And a lot of his life story and career trajectory will come from that. But I will give this brief introduction that he was born in Midland, Ontario, in Georgian Bay. He still lives and has a studio in the area. John, correct me if I'm saying anything that's wrong. But I also want to get in some things that I think John might not tell us about. But basically, he is known, primarily for his landscapes of many places, including starting with the Georgian Bay, which he is intimately familiar with, and many other landscapes all over Canada, US, and Europe. He was educated at McMaster University here in Hamilton, one of a lot of connections to this area, graduating in '73. And he also went to DVSA. So I really want to give a big welcome home to John, and thank you for returning to us and sharing your knowledge with us. It's really, really is wonderful. But also, of course, a lot of us sitting here are going, well, how did you get from DVSA, where many of us have studied, all to where you are now? So we'll go over that journey. The other thing, John has had multiple museum shows, and one of the most significant early in his career is called Painting the Bay. That was in 1993 at the McMichael. Many others over the years, plus a current show that some of you may know about called Many Lives Mark This Place. If I talk fast, don't worry. All of this information is in the handout that is available in the chat, okay? So you don't have to scribble too quickly. But the thing I want to tell you about the Many Lives show, John's most recent body of work, is that a portion of it is available very nearby for you to go look at the Woodstock Art Gallery in nearby Woodstock. And so I encourage you to go take a look at that. And it's such a good opportunity after hearing this talk. Okay. I do want to add these additional facts. You can check out John's many other shows, group shows, solo shows all over the world, articles and publications, as I said, books, which are catalogs of many of his shows. And I would also, he has been the recipient of many commissioned paintings. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit. numerous awards and grants. You know, I wrote down here, too numerous to mention. Yes, they're just enormous number, but we have to mention the big one, which he received in 2021, and that's the Order of Canada. So welcome, John. Okay, can everyone clap? Because at least he can see you clap, okay? Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
And welcome everybody. And thank you, Jody. And thank you, Lisa, for organizing this.
John, where is this taken? Just quickly, just situate us.
Well, the photograph's in my LaFontaine studio. It's a big studio space, about 50 feet long and 26 feet wide, but that makes it look much cleaner than it normally is, because the painting was large enough that I had to paint it on a back wall and remove everything from the surrounding area. So it's a painting of Halifax. It's on 3 canvases. You can see the marks differentiating, vertical marks differentiating each canvas. And you can also see the working pastel drawing for it on the left side. And then that's the palette table I work on. So the top is a big sheet of glass. That's where I mix my paint. All the paints are stored underneath. My brushes are on the right-hand side of that. And it's on wheels, so I can push it in front of the part of the painting I'm working on at the time. So this was sort of the central painting for an exhibition that toured around the country called Cities.
Okay.
And then was given as a gift to the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia by the Bank of Nova Scotia.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I think if many of you are like me, I looked at this image and thought, oh my God, how can anyone paint that big and that beautifully? And I assume you didn't start painting this way, John.
No. This, we're 2/3 of the way through my career as a painter when you're seeing this image here.
Okay.
So this is roughly around 2008, 2009.
Okay. So okay, now my screen, my images. Oops, there we go. We're on to the next several images. Just going back a little bit to the beginning, John, can you tell us first tell us where this slide is and the importance of this particular landscape to you?
Well, it's the eastern shore of Georgian Bay, where basically I've grown up, although these are the low granite islands. So that's where I go in the summer. I live down at the bottom of Georgian Bay, which is more like farmland that you'd see around Dundas. But I've lived here all my life. So it's what I would describe as my home landscape. It's the place that defines my sense of light and scale and space and all these things. So everything else in the world gets referred to it. It's sort of like, it's like what got hardwired into my brain at a young age. So when I went to McMaster, my very first class, George Wallace, it was a drawing class, and he set up a whole bunch of stools, 3-legged stools stacked in a gigantic stack about 15 feet tall. And he told us he wanted to draw this because he wanted to, teach us how to see as artists. And I didn't understand what he meant, but I think he meant how to start to see analytically, how to break something down into its component parts so an image can be made of it. And then he went on to say, if your idea of being an artist is to go out in Georgian Bay and paint little studies of the landscape, we're going to disabuse you of this, which was exactly my idea of why I went to art school, because that's what I wanted to do. So I just had to sort of shut my mouth and put my head down and learn as much as I could. But as soon as I left art school, I went back up on Georgian Bay and started painting it. Often out on location, but this is a 4x5 foot painting. So it was done in my studio from a sketch I did.
Okay. Let's just take a quick look at Georgian Bay. That must have been quite a shock in school.
Well, it was. And when I tell that story, some people think that I'm criticizing George. Not at all. He was a great teacher, but it was certainly a humbling experience to say that, because I had shown him a bunch of sketches at Georgian Bay to get into art school. And so I was sure I was the only person in that class who he was referring to.
Right. And what years were these? This was in the 70s, right?
In the 70s. So if you look at up of the far shoreline, there's a place called Britt. That's where I spend my summers.
Here?
Yes, up there. And then in Midland in the wintertime.
Down here.
Yeah, down there.
Okay. And you were born and raised in this landscape, is that
yes.
Yes. Okay. And can you tell, did you always know you wanted to be a painter or an artist, or how did that go?
No, I was actually at McMaster studying economics and history because I wanted to be a lawyer. And then I worked in a law office between my second and third year of economics and history, and realized it wasn't as exciting as I thought it was. And I thought art would be more exciting. So I registered in first year fine art as my electives, and then found it really engaging. And so just dropped the economics and history part and continued on studying fine art. And then I went to DVSA in the evenings and studied with Gordon Perrier. McMaster was a very traditional art education, very solid grounding in the craftsmanship of being an artist. But Gordon taught what I thought at the time were much more exciting kind of courses, painting much more loosely. And so I studied watercolor with him for 2 years.
Got it. So John, when you say traditional, what kinds of things did you come out of, let's say both experience? What skills do you think you acquired that served you well in your career as a painter?
Well, I learned that I learned the craftsmanship of being a printmaker or a painter or a sculptor. Now, I've never used the sculpture part of it, but I learned how to stretch canvases and put rabbit skin glue on and put traditional gesso on top of that. I learned all of the skills in being a printmaker. I mean, George Wallace made us grind our own pigments.
Oh my God.
Our own printer's ink. So, and that was all very helpful, because I don't think you can teach somebody how to be an artist. I think you can, art school does two things. It can teach you the skills you need, and it can teach you, I understood that falling in love with art was an important part of being an artist, that most great artists had fallen in love with art of other artists, and that was the beginning point for them. And that certainly happened with me at McMaster. A great emphasis on German expressionism.
But you also did some early art work even as a child, is that right? Or
oh yes, my grandfather was an amateur painter and hung around with the professional painters of his time, guys like Frank Panabaker, also from Hamilton. A landscape painter. So I knew that I'd met some of those people. I knew they existed, and I knew you could be a professional artist as a vocation, which I don't think anybody else in the town I grew up in knew. I don't think that anybody I grew up with ever imagined that being an artist was a profession. In fact, my father didn't understand that.
I was wondering how appalled your family might have been when you switched from the esteemed profession of the law to painter.
I lied. I said I was going to be an art teacher.
Aha. Okay. So in our talks, well, I guess I would like to move a little bit to the period where you're out of school and doing what I think we like to call now finding your own voice. Was that, how did that, or did you feel like you came out of school fully formed with your own particular vision? Okay.
No, I didn't. It took me a very long time. It took me about 10 years, I would say. And it was really a matter of backing up far enough into art history that I found the painters who were painting landscapes in a representational way. Because in the mid-70s, when I graduated, all the serious artists that I could see in terms of who the magazines were covering and who's getting exhibitions were doing post-painterly abstraction, no subject matter, and a very reduced way of applying paint in a very minimal way on canvases. So I went back in, say, Canadian art to David Milne, who you've got here, and you've actually picked a perfect painting, because this is 6 Mile Lake, which is essentially almost part of the shore of Georgian Bay. So it's the period of time where Milne was painting in the landscape that I was familiar with. And a painting like this had a really big influence on me. You know, when I left art school and finished up in mid-April of whatever year it was, 1973 or 4, I got in a canoe and I paddled out into some islands and painted paintings that looked pretty much exactly like this. So it took me quite a long time to work my way through all the influences and start to be able to identify among those the pieces that were really more my own. And I didn't think they were the best pieces, but I understood that those were the directions I had to I should be following. But it really wasn't until it was around 1979 or 80 that the pieces started falling in place, and I started doing more aerial views and putting stories into the paintings.
Okay. I have a few more slides to look at of other artists that you said you looked at that time. And of course, all of us are many of us are landscape painters here, or we love painting outside or the subject matter of landscape. I think the the weight of the group of 7 and related painters weighs heavily on us, but also we have a lot to learn from them too, I think. Can you talk about, I think one thing people struggle with is, what can I learn, but how do I escape?
Well, you can learn, there's an infinite amount of things you can learn. How you escape is you simply start painting it yourself as much as possible. And the key thing is you have to understand how you see the landscape and how you might see it differently than they do. If you don't see it differently at all, you're in trouble. But it's also very difficult to realize how you see it differently. So you have to have enough intelligence to respond to the emotional impact that things have on you. If something makes you stop, or you keep going back to something repeatedly, even if you don't think it's going to be a subject for a painting, you have to stop and say, well, why am I always looking at this? What's engaging me about it? So for me, with Georgian Bay, it was the group of 7 painted it without much reference to people being there. And whenever I was in a place on Georgian Bay, I was aware of my own personal history, my family's, the community I lived in, its history, and everything going back to when the Jesuits arrived here in 1618 or whenever they first arrived to try to Christianize the Wendat. I was aware of all that history. So I thought, well, I should be somehow trying to include that into the paintings. But it's a very, very difficult process. It's easier to think that the work you're doing that looks like the artist you admire is better than the other work, which is sometimes more personal and giving you information about where to go. God,
truer words were never spoken. I do think that is so true. Okay, aside from Milne, and we have a few, we'll just do a quick review of some of the greats in the past.
Yes, Goodrich Roberts, painting wet into wet, big influence, especially the wet into wet part.
Okay. And just for people who don't know what wet into wet is, can you describe it?
Well, you're painting you're not allowing the oil paint to dry, really. So when he painted that sky, that kind of slate gray blue, he would have painted the white clouds into paint that's already wet. He painted them on top of the blue, and you accounted for a bit of mixture of the blue in. And especially when he comes down to the foreground, he would put in the gray area of the rocks and then paint those dark cracks in with darker black gray paint. And it just has a different look than if you're putting it on a dry surface. It makes everything feel like nothing jumps in front of the other dramatically.
And you were did you come out of art school as a wet into wet painter, or
No,
did you have to learn how to do that?
I developed that as in fact, in the very beginning, I thought I should paint into acrylics because they dried quicker.
Yeah.
And I had problems figuring out how to paint wet into wet. But eventually, I was a horrible painter in acrylics, so I just abandoned it. And it just eventually became my working method, but it took about 10 or 15 years.
And if you were to summarize 3 tips for working wet into wet from your 10 years of experience, for those of us who keep struggling with it.
Well, like all things with landscape painting, the relative lightness and darkness of something, its tone, is the crucial thing that Goodrich Roberts painted paintings that were almost identical to this, where the water was yellow and the sky was purple and the trees were brown and the rocks were green. And as long as the tonal arrangements were correct, it all read as a landscape and a space exactly the way this painting does. So the color is less a factor in determining the creation of depth and space than tonal arrangements. So those have to be accurate. And you just have to understand how thick the paint is and how much it's going to be affected by what you put over it. So if you're putting a dark into a light, it doesn't change much. If you're trying to put a light into a dark, it's almost impossible. And the viscosity of the paint matters too, how thick and how oily it is. The oilier it is, the harder it is to get things to mix into it.
Okay. So just let me quickly see, am I covering some things that people are interested in? You can go thumbs up or hi, or I'm seeing some thumbs up. Okay. All right. And I think this is Lismer, group of 7.
Yes, and so, that's a small sketch, 8 by 10 inches. It's the subject matter on the eastern shoreline of Georgian Bay. And for me, I'm interested in sort of the freshness, the decision-making that I can see going on as the paint is applied. I love the little spots where the birch board is left unpainted and strikes through. It's kind of an ochre brown color. And I love how little attention to specific detail there is, and how he sort of accepted the shape of the trees, although they probably didn't look exactly like that, but they have this wonderful feel of being bent around a bit by the wind without being kind of formulaic. And the colors are lovely. They're muted, but they're lovely.
Really? Yes. And here we have Tom Thompson.
Yeah, that's a very famous spot. That's the McAllen Cottage north of Georgian Bay, which is pretty close to Midland. And I do spend time up there.
Wow.
And that's a view looking inland from a spot called Split Rock.
And the cottage we all want.
Well, the cottage is still there. It's the one that had the group of 7 murals painted on the.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. So here I have a few more of your Georgian Bay paintings coming up next. And one thing I wondered if you could talk about a little, I can see the gestural brush work and some of the wet into wet thing, but obviously the color is fairly different than a lot of the group of 7.
Yes, I tend to like to paint in a really full bright light with the light behind me. So not a lot of shadow, maybe the sun a little bit off to one side behind me. So it's almost always a landscape that's really fully illuminated. The colors are bright. I tend to do the sketches and the studies at sort of 9 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon in that period of time. This is a larger painting, again, done in the studio. And I will always once digital photography came along, I'll take a photograph of what stopped me as well, just as a reference point. Many things I remember very clearly, other things I don't remember as well. So the sketch and the photograph are for the things I don't remember. The feeling about the place I remember. The sense of light I remember. The color I remember. But little details about just exactly where the crack in the rock were, I need a sketch or a photograph to make a bigger painting from.
Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about your process. I assume maybe this is a quicker painting.
Yeah, 22 by 24 inch canvas, which is the largest size I'll work on outside. It's a very windy landscape, and after that, it becomes like a sail.
Yeah.
And it just takes off with my French easel attached to it. So it falls over. So
could you talk a little bit about the viewpoints? Maybe the other one would be a better one. You know, that here you're pretty much using a single point viewpoint, if I'm not mistaken. But you can talk about that because it'll play into just a little bit, and it'll play into what we will talk about later.
Well, these are all from one point of view and more or less one point in time, sort of. And they're mostly at ground level because I'm going around in a boat, a canoe or a rowboat or a little motorboat, getting out, walking on the shoreline. It's a very low shoreline. The highest rock might be 20 feet above the water. So they all are from ground level, but I've always, since the early 80s, also painted an awful lot of my paintings from an aerial perspective, like an imagined point 300 or 400 feet up in the air. And until 2014, I had to either imagine that or rent an airplane. After 2014, I was able to use a drone to take photographs from the air. So a lot of the big paintings I've done, even the bigger ones of Georgian Bay, have this kind of elevated viewpoint where you have several viewpoints. You're looking out at the horizon, sort of down obliquely at the middle ground, and then straight down at the foreground.
Right. Thank you. And I'll ask you to point that out a little bit more as we move into the next series of paintings. Your first, big show at the McMichael. Some more beautiful Georgian Bay, and there you are. Classic group of seven.
Yes, this was actually taken by a kayaker going by. I didn't see him. And then he got in touch with me and sent me the images and said, please, as long as you use them, just give me credit. But I've since lost them.
Well, thank you, Mr. Kayaker. All credit to you. And I think many of our viewers will find this setup very familiar, as many of them work like this. Okay, and here you are also in another landscape, obviously. I don't think this is Georgian Bay, and you are drawing.
Yes, it's a little handmade sketchbook. I had a friend in Newfoundland make them for me because then I could control the kind of paper watercolor paper that was in them. And this is the Milk River in southern Alberta, and this is actually March. So the reason I'm sitting beside a big boulder is because it's windy. The boulder is giving me protection from the wind. The wind's coming from my sort of back, and the boulder is keeping me from freezing.
Okay. Let's see. And I just pulled from one of your books, kind of one of your drawings. This, we'll talk more when we look at some of your bigger paintings, but you're clearly a beautiful drawer. Is that a skill that you developed, learned in school? Do you think it's important for people to have that skill?
Well, yes, it is. I mean, I certainly learned to draw at McMaster, but not draw like this. And I had a little epiphany driving along the north shore of Lake Superior once. My wife was driving a Volkswagen van. You know, all hippies had Volkswagen vans in the 1970s. And we were coming back from Thunder Bay, and I looked out over Superior and I thought, I can just draw it in this more simple childlike way. I don't have to draw like they taught me at McMaster. And so I just sort of drew in a way that felt really easy and normal. And that's what basically in the end matured into this kind of drawing system. But the close together parallel lines, that's something I would have learned in art school.
Those indicate areas of shadow.
Yes. So I'm just, I'm using the sketch to collect the kind of information I need to make a bigger painting. Again, the things I don't remember. This is the community of Buren in Newfoundland. And actually, if you take the right-hand page, flip it over and sort of fold it so that the right-hand edge butts up against the gutter, you'll have the next part of the view. And I did that on the left so that I ended up with a big long view. And eventually the woman who made the sketchbooks just said, I can make an accordion sketchbook for you and you don't have to do that. So then I started getting, accordion sketchbooks made that are sort of work like this. They just keep folding out. And if you want to keep adding on in either direction, you can. But I have a whole bookshelf full of this is mostly what I do is make sketches and studies. The paintings are, there's less amount of my total time making art, making paintings than making studies.
Very interesting. Okay, so we'll just finish up with a few more of the Georgian Bay area. This looks like a plein air one as well, if I'm not mistaken. The speed of the paint and the marks. This one too.
Yes, yeah, that is the landscape just south of where I spend my summers.
Just south, okay. So it's at this point that we're going to move to your body of work that appeared in a big show at the McMichael in '93 called Painting the Bay. And whoa, something happened. Obviously this still looks like landscape, but can you talk about what happened that initiated this big change in how you painted, I would say, or somewhat, but still tied you to the landscape? And just so you can see again how different, or maybe talk about some of the differences between something like this and then getting to this.
The paint handling is similar. The wet into wet painting is similar. What you're missing are a series of paintings done in the 80s that were kind of very minimal views of a landscape with tiny little figures floating around in them. So those were the beginning aerial views. So in this one, I've just said to myself, well, if I want to paint the whole of the mouth of the Magnetawan River, which is where the community of Britt is, it's up on the right-hand side of this landscape. I'll just imagine I'm above the bridge on Highway 69. And then the next thing is the railroad bridge. And then we come to the right-hand side of the Still River coming in. And then we go out to Wright's Marina where I get in my boat. And then we go out to this big funnel-like shape, which is the mouth of the inlet. And so a lot of this, I knew what it looked like already because it's a place I go to all the time. But the other parts I would go and sketch or take a photograph. So I went and sketched the railroad bridge. I spent some time over on the left side, which is Bing Inlet, where I hadn't been going as often. I didn't know what was there. So I sketched what was there. And I think there was probably quite a few little preliminary studies and maybe some preliminary paintings to figure out this composition, how to make it work. And then I would have painted it in exactly the same way I've described the other ones. It's, the ground is toned with a light red. The whole subject matter is sketched in with red paint in a line drawing kind of way. And then it was painted from top to bottom.
Okay.
Really quickly. So a lot of preparation, a lot of thinking about the composition, lots of time, probably 2 or 3 days adjusting things in the composition by rubbing things out with linseed oil, moving it over here a bit. But the painting itself was probably done in 3 or 4 days.
And this is a very large painting.
It's 5 by 7 feet. Yeah.
And I think one thing I wanted people to think about was how different, that when you talk about an aerial landscape. And I mean, were you shocked that you could paint it from memory, sort of? I mean, I know you also had painted at eye level, but you're clearly in your head projecting yourself up above the landscape, right?
Yeah, well, when I was like in my early teens, I had these dreams of flying over landscapes, and they unfolded below me like a movie almost. Wow. It was really a great dream. I had it like over and over and over again. And I think all I've been trying to do for like 45 years is recreate the feeling of that dream.
Wow.
I'm especially interested in spots that I really know well.
Yeah.
And like that if I end up with a big area that's sort of an empty part of the composition, I sort of know what's there.
Right.
And put that in, I can make some marks that say this is a little pond, or this is an area of rock, or because those moments arise as you move on in the painting. You go, oh, I hadn't really thought about what's going to happen in that part. And it helps to be familiar enough with the place that you can say, okay, now I can make this, I can figure out what's there because I know what's there. I can just paint it.
Okay. And you were also looking at this. Let me just go on to this, because we're starting to also see more of figurative elements and narrative elements, I think. Maybe you can tell us about that and the influence of this painting. Well,
this is Altdorfer's painting of the Battle of Issus, and it's the battle between Alexander the Great and Darius I of Persia. It's in the Alta Pinakothek in Munich. And when I left art school, I did a European tour, about 4 or 5 months in the winter. And I came across this painting in the gallery, and it just absolutely stopped me in my tracks. I'm sure I was there for an hour and a half looking at the painting. Bought several reproductions of it in the shop, and understood that it was something that I wanted to be able to accomplish something similar to this, but I had no idea how I would do it. So I just pasted it in front of a sketchbook, and it was there as a reminder that I'd like to be able to figure out how to do this. Not exactly the same, obviously, but some kind of similar aerial view that had big story happening in it. And then I went back and saw the painting about 5 years ago, and it didn't impress me anymore. Nearly as impressive, but
yes, because yours took over. I mean, isn't that what we want to do? We first we want to imitate the people we love, and then we want to conquer them, perhaps. Okay, so let's look at a few more from this series. One thing I'm dying to ask you is, like, especially compared to some other more, let's say, traditional work, were you worried about what people would think? And did you have any doubts yourself about what was going on in these paintings? And if so, how did you deal with them?
No, doubt never escapes an artist. There's always an element of doubt. Sometimes it's massive and it incapacitates you, and other times it's rather minimal and you charge ahead. Now, when I painted this painting, it must have been minimal, because this is one crazy ass painting. So it's Killarney, which was heavily painted by the group of 7. And I was there on a trip with the McMichael, where they were taking a bunch of their big donors up to stay in the Killarney Mountain Lodge. And we went into this lake, Topaz Lake. And this is a painting done from a sketch I did, but the title is Christ in Killarney. So I thought, the group of 7 presents this place as a wilderness, but it's not really a wilderness, but let's say it is. Where does the idea of wilderness come from? Well, it's really kind of a late 18th century invention, but there is one reference that goes way back, which is Christ in the wilderness. And when Christ was in the wilderness, he was tempted by the devil, who said, all this could be yours, kind of thing. So, and it's a strange idea that we have that a wilderness or that part of our land as Canada could be ours. Like it's almost like a property thing, which I don't think the Indigenous people thought of the land that way. So the devil's up in the sky, and Christ is on the little red figure in the foreground on that white rock. And there's gigantic lilies growing. There's a waterfall coming out of a cliff. All of those are totally invented things. But the other part is more or less what you would see of Topaz Lake as you're approaching it from a nearby hill. And then I did a series of paintings. It's about 8 feet tall, about 5 feet wide, of a friend of mine, Gilbert DeRoche, who was a folk artist who lived nearby, who died in the early 90s. And this is sort of all series of paintings based on his funeral at the church in Perkinsfield, which is nearby where I live in LaFontaine. And so he's being carried up heavenward by an angel, and then these other figures are sort of him. He was in and out of jail, but he also found religion in his last years. So it was kind of a mixed up life. And you're looking down at the church and the crossroads at Perkinsfield in the foreground, and then out towards Thunder Bay Beach in the middle distance, and then out across the islands of Georgian Bay and up the shoreline.
These do feel, I mean, they have sort of a godlike perspective. And they do remind me, I have to say, of many narrative religious paintings, the long tradition of it, starting, well, before Giotto even, stained glass windows, telling a story in various scenes, all in the one thing. But
yeah, so I'm interested in the art that came before in the late Gothic period, and I'm especially interested in Northern European painting, because I think that's the light. In fact, the Northern European painters have an even more northerly light than most Canadians do. So it's this sideways light that it's always coming in from the side, because the sun gets up and it doesn't always come overhead. It sort of gets up to 30 degrees and then just moves around above the horizon and then it drops. So that light that the Flemish painters and the German painters and the British painters paint in is sort of, I think, more typical of the light we have here in Canada.
Yes, and yeah. I really would love to talk more about that, but I have so many more things to show you all, and I don't want to tax John too much. And this is another, of these series that, where the narration, or there's a narrative that combines with the landscape, and it's related to the landscape, if I'm not mistaken.
This is an aerial view of Midland and Penetanguishene. The Georgian Bay is the dark water sort of from the horizon down. Penetanguishene Bay is on the left, Midland on the right. And then there's a road that connects the two, which was the road the British military built, called the Old Penetanguishene Road. And I think the full title is The Expulsion of Paradise as it occurred on the Old Penetanguishene Road. So Adam is being kicked out of paradise on the lower right, and Eve's not with him. She's just a little image of a Madonna figure painted above his shoulder. And then this is pretty crazy painting too. The red guy in the sky with the beard is God. And then there's a woman giving birth right underneath him with a little baby popping out. And then there's these two, there's an angel guiding Adam out of paradise. And then there's this strange figure of a pair of legs with a hand and a penis and a flame flying out from it, which is sort of like man with his head disconnected from his body, which comes from a very famous scene in the movie, Terry Gilliam movie of, I can't remember what it was called. Baron von Munchausen, where Robin Williams is this god in the sky who can unscrew his head, and then when he unscrews his head, he's just this flaming thing of emotions and uncontrollable sexual energy flying around. So that's right. Sort of, but the idea is that like underneath a woman giving birth, there's a little paint tube, and then there's the baby underneath. So the idea is that women do the truly creative thing by creating life, and men just ramble around on the periphery, being men. So I think that's an even crazier painting than the one before it.
Purposely, I mean, you know, it's very far from a Georgian Bay landscape, and yeah. I think it must have been very brave to. You must have had a certain amount of bravery and a certain. I mean, but or were you working on these feeling like I'm onto something so great and it's
no,
so exciting?
No, I didn't really. I thought there would be some people that would think these were stupid, and wouldn't like them. But I just was so excited about doing them. But the curious thing is, you know, this ended up in the McMichael collection, and it was the one painting that set Bob McMichael off. Decided that he wanted to regain control of the museum and get rid of some of it.
What a story!
Shit they've been collecting.
Yeah.
And this is one of the paintings that he singled out.
Oh, that's so.
He wanted to put in the collection. So I did find somebody that really didn't like it.
Yes, and I'm very glad that that's a beautiful story. Thank you for telling us that. Okay, so I think the next series, because I want to get to your city series, these are more from a big exhibition that you had that was called Big North. Yes, that was and also continued the idea of the paintings of the landscapes plus stories, and not always biblical stories, but also could be stories from local stories, like the one of the Gilbert der Crocier.
So in this case, the stories are all taking place in the landscape above, or in the sky above the horizon, and then the area below is, you know, for me anyway, a fairly literal depiction of the view of the La Cloche Range and Killarney, and the town of Killarney is in the foreground. So the very dark thing in the foreground is George Island. Then there's a little strait of water, the town of Killarney, which is mostly just waterfront marinas and hotel. And then proceeding back into the La Cloche Mountains. And then the stuff in the sky is stories I overheard when I was drinking at the end of every day in the bar, which is called the Trails End Lounge, where all the local guys, the old duffers, used to build boats and do all that kind of traditional fishing and stuff like that, would gather for a few beer at the end of the day.
Got it. Okay. Let's look at a few more of these. They're all beautiful. They're all gigantic too.
Yeah, that would be 16 feet long by 6 feet tall. And that's the fire that occurred near where I spend my time in the summer. And it was luckily put out by some rather drunken 19-year-olds that were camping on a nearby island, but they had the good sense once they realized the fire was burning they knew where the fire pumps were located at different cottages, and they just ran and grabbed them. And they put it out with those and their beer coolers. They emptied all the beer out of their coolers. And then when the Lands and Forests finally arrived, they blamed them for starting it. And so for me, I was luckily able to let the Lands and Forest people know that it wasn't these guys. They were actually the guys who saved it, and that they should give them some credit.
Okay, I think this is our last slide in this series. This is Cobalt, again with some, I mean, I think it, you know, why don't we combine more? I mean, it was a very interesting idea to combine narrative stories with the landscape that inspired them. I mean, it's like, it feels like a lot of painting innovations once a person like you does it, they seem obvious. But it takes a long time to be that way. Or I don't know how you would characterize it.
Well, my problem was trying to figure out a way to combine the two, because I didn't really have, I didn't have any obvious examples to look. I had other people that were doing aspects of it, so I just did it in a way that seemed to work, and I couldn't really paint the human elements too realistically, because I'm doing an aerial viewpoint. If I put the human elements in, the scale would be so small you wouldn't be able to see them. So I had to put them in a way that they didn't look like I was painting them to belong on the land. They had to be floating between the viewer and the landscape. And to do that at that point, I thought they had to be done in a kind of pictographic way, really. You know, there were lots of jokes about painting stick figures. And some people really still find this work incongruous. They don't think the two things work together, and other people are charmed by it. So, you know, you just have to be willing to lose part of your following, but knowing that you might pick up new people.
Okay. All right. Now we're now into the portion of, so if you're wondering what's left, there's a group of city paintings which are the subject of a book, amazing set of paintings and preparatory drawings and watercolors that we'll look at, and then some plein air paintings, and we'll conclude with a couple images from John's current show. So this is, does everyone know? I mean, everyone from around here, this is Hamilton. John, you told me this is your first. Can you talk about the evolution of this painting briefly, and then we'll move into the rest of the cities series, because this was a big turn where the narrative elements are sort of disappearing at this point, although I know you continue to do some paintings in that regard, and then you started focusing on the cities. How did that happen?
Well, I was painting, you know, if you go back to Cobalt, the previous one, I mean, you have to go back there, people remember it, but you know, I was painting the little towns around Newfoundland coast and around Georgian Bay. And I just began to get more interested in the infrastructure that we build to make a town or make a city. And I remembered having driven across the Burlington Skyway Bridge when I was a student at Mac, and how beautiful the harbor looked with the Stelco and Dofasco belching smoke and the escarpment behind. So I went back down to sketch it and photograph it. I drove over the bridge, had my camera all ready to shoot at the window, and it just looked totally uninspiring and uninteresting. So I thought, I got to the other side, I pulled off, I went on to the beaches that are in the lower right corner. And I thought, well, I've got the memory of what it felt like. So I don't really need to repeat that. I just need specific information. So that I then drove up to the escarpment, which you see in the middle distance, but over top of Burlington. There's a view above Dundas back, in the reverse view to what this is. And then I went along Concession Road on the edge of the escarpment at Hamilton and did a series of sketches. And then I went down into the harbor, and a friend of mine gave me a Zodiac. He had a Zodiac moored in the harbor. And I drove all around Dofasco. I went into where they load the ships. I poked around all of the industrial areas, and I took photographs and made sketches for a couple of days. And then I just said to myself, okay, if I'm in the east end of Hamilton, 500 feet in the air above the landscape, what would it look like? And I did a series of preliminary drawings, came up with this composition, and then made the painting.
It's amazing. I mean, first of all, I'm thrilled that the series started with Hamilton, and that so much of it could come from a memory too. I think, clearly memory played such a big role in this, even more, because the memory was more important than the actual photographs.
Yes, and memory was a beautiful light. So this is what I was trying to capture in this painting, was that that this is a beautiful natural setting, that because it's adjacent to water, it creates beautiful light because you get a lot of reflection off the water, and that it has this heavy industrial landscape on it. And very often we don't see beyond the heavy industrial landscape.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. Okay, here are a few more.
So that's a pastel study in preparation for the painting.
Right. And this is something you're in the habit of doing when you work on the larger paintings.
Yes, it'll be about 20 by 20 inches, around there, 24 by 24 inches, the study.
And here would be a few sketches of Hamilton.
Yeah, those are the ones I did from the top of the mountain on Concession Avenue or Concession Street, looking down, always putting the kind of the Burlington Skyway Bridge in the center of the painting at the horizon.
So I assume that, I put in another impossible influence, this aerial view. This would be of the farmland, or this is a Wayne Thiebaud, a California painter, recently passed away.
I wasn't thinking of
you weren't thinking of these.
Well, when I painted these paintings, I wasn't conscious of this work.
Yeah.
Somebody showed me some more recently, and I said, wow, I must have seen these somewhere, because there's enough influence in them on my work. The aerial viewpoint, the thick paint. So.
Yeah, but also developments come at the same time, painting.
Well, I think we're often, sometimes we're conscious of the things that influence us, and other times we're not conscious.
Yes.
And I think if you spot something that clearly is related to what you've been doing and the person did it before you, you should say you've been influenced by it. Rather than denying it.
Oops, sorry. And this is with the Skyway on the other side of Hamilton,
yes.
another more recent cities one. Okay.
Yes.
And you can see the escarpment up here.
Yes, the escarpment is always bigger in people's minds than it really is, so I made it bigger than it really is.
It's so true. If you ever fly over it, it's teeny.
Yeah.
Okay. This was another painting you cited as a possible influence. It's Kokoschka. I always say his name wrong.
Yeah, that's the artist I was consciously aware of when I was making the city paintings. And again, I saw them very quickly. I was in Kathy Gibbons' house. She was a friend from art school, a close friend, and she had a book of his city paintings, and she showed it to me, and I kind of just leafed through it quickly, flipping from page to page. And then we were off doing something else. I put the book down, gave it back to her. So I really didn't spend more than 3 or 4 minutes looking at it, but clearly they made a huge impression on me. So this kind of aerial view, this kind of expressionist way of painting the landscape, and the kind of density that the urban environment creates, but how he still managed to make it about light on the landscape.
Okay. I think this is another small Hamilton. I just wanted to show, let's go through a couple other city ones. These are Toronto.
Yeah, those are.
Yeah, and this is a series of preparatory. I sort of, maybe you could give us a rundown of how you might approach painting the whole city of Toronto, or the whole shoreline, let's say.
Well, first of all, I'm always looking for places that are on water and on complex harbors, which is why Hamilton's actually way more interesting than Toronto. Toronto's only sort of interesting down, for me anyway, down at the harbor, looking east or looking west. The quickest thing to do is to go up in a public building that's got a viewing room, which the CN Tower does. So these were done from the CN Tower. But the next thing that's possible is to go to a flight school that's nearby and rent a Cessna plane with a pilot who flies you up, and you can take photographs, and it's not terribly expensive to do. And so there's a flight school on Toronto Island, which is on the left-hand side of this painting. So you get in a Cessna, it takes off, and immediately you're on downtown Toronto. You can do 3 loops of the downtown area and land again and only be up for half an hour. And if the light is right, it will be fantastic. And you'll get lots of very usable photographs, not ones you can copy, but ones that have information in it that you'll need to fill in parts of a painting. And this would be a kind of 5.5 by 6.5 foot painting.
And so these are done later in the studio.
Yes.
And and as reference, you're using all of the things you've done before.
Yes, starting with photographs, then making small watercolor sketches, and then making the painting. And another view of Toronto a little further back with the Don River in the foreground. And again, I'm sort of overemphasizing the roads and the railroads and the infrastructure, making them really bigger than they actually are. A friend of mine, a painter, said, would it be fair to say that your paintings of these paintings of cities are like caricatures? And I said, yeah, they are sort of. They're like, I've taken certain things and exaggerated them. And I want them, but I still want them to be quite recognizable. So, you know, in this case, the CN Tower sort of says this is Toronto.
Yeah. And do you have any feeling or conscious feeling, or is it just a reaction afterward that I have, is seeing them as living, breathing organisms, which of course they are. I mean, and these are the arteries, not just the traffic, but the pulsing arteries, the lifeblood of the city.
Yeah, I was conscious of that. I mean, I wanted, it's why I didn't paint little narrative elements in them, because I felt the city as a whole was like a human organism.
Yeah.
And that I didn't need to add stories to it. Plus, I had high horizons in these in order to get all the city in, and there wasn't much room, and I needed a quiet area. So if I filled the sky up, it would have just been too chaotic for me.
Got it. Okay. Sorry. Whoops. Hold on again. Okay. I'm going to, just so we can look at some, there we go. There's my little, here's Toronto again. Amazing. Yeah. And
again, the reverse view looking.
Yeah, and the CN Tower. Yeah. And I guess this is a pastel sketch, right, of another view of Toronto. This would be from, you know, looking south, essentially.
Yeah, so that was a commission for the Granite Club in Toronto, and that's the preliminary. I would have done about 3 or 4 pastel studies each, maybe 6 inches by 18 inches, and then selected 2 of them and then presented those 2 to the committee and said, you know, pick either one of these and I can make a painting of it. So that's sort of what we call a maquette. It's a study that I base the painting on, and it's done just so that I make sure that we're both happy with what the final product might look like, and that I haven't misinterpreted what we've agreed upon. So I don't do commissions unless it's something that I'm doing. If somebody came to me now and wanted a commission of a city, I might or might not be able to do it. But I don't move out of what I'm presently doing substantially to do commissions. And I just have to make sure that the person doing it is interested in what I'm doing presently. And then it's just a matter of figuring out subject matter and viewpoint. And we find an area that we're both excited about and an idea we're both excited about. And then I make the study. And then when they say, yes, this looks great, I make a final painting. And the reason I do 2 is to avoid the situation where they think they want input and therefore they say, I like that blue on the right, but I want you to make it something else. So by giving people a choice of 2 things, that's a choice, that's giving them input. And then I very seldom get, could you change this?
That's brilliant. I mean, a number of people here do commissions and are always struggle with the client input and then how not to sell their soul. but I think you've given us two really good pointers on that. Thank you. Here you are collecting more information high up.
Yes, that's doing watercolors in a sketchbook in Seattle. Again, that's a publicly available viewing point on the top of a building. And you can't see it, but between my body and the sketchbook under my right arm is a little Winsor & Newton outdoor watercolor kit that it's a plastic thing that opens up and folds out, and you can hold it in your hand. It's small enough to hold.
Wow.
I've got the palette and the water in my hand, sketchbook sitting on the railing, and I'm balancing it with the end of my finger. So it's all, and I can set that all up in 2 or 3 minutes.
Fabulous.
A hugely important thing when you're working outside on sketches is if it takes you an hour and a half to set up your kit, whatever you were interested in has disappeared.
Brilliant. I hope you guys are writing all this down. These are such, okay, I just, here's a rather large, is this an accordion one or one of those open?
No, it's what they call a Coptic binding. It's a binding that has no spine, so it folds out flat. It's a view of Vancouver, and it's actually done from a series of other sketches that I've combined and compressed, and a series of aerial photos I took from a seaplane I was able to rent at Burrard Inlet. And I had him fly along a line to the south of downtown Vancouver, so I could catch all the bridges that cross, can't remember the name of that little bay in there that forms like an inner harbor, but just for small boats. And then I wanted to get the railroad lines coming in from the east, which is the right-hand side, and then the mountains across Burrard Inlet on the North Shore.
Yeah, so how do you decide what to include with so much visual information? How do you decide what to include and also have it still make sense as a whole?
Well, every time anybody sits in front of a landscape or tries to consider a landscape, there's actually way too much information. So your big job is to figure out what it is that stopped you, what's interested you, and what kind of information you need for that, which means you're leaving out about 98% of what's there. You're just not going to deal with that. I remember my sculptor instructor at McMaster, John Miecznikowski, once said he took his drawing class out into the landscape to have them paint. And this is first year drawing. And he said the problem is they had no idea what they were seeing. They couldn't make drawings because it was just utter confusion of visual information. They didn't have any idea how to eliminate most of it and concentrate on the essentials. So
I mean, don't you think that's somewhat exacerbated by photographs? Sorry to interrupt. In the sense that people get tied to every detail in the photograph and they don't learn about, picture making.
Yes, although a photograph, if you want to make something from a single point in time and space, a photograph does that as well. And it does help organize things, but there's a kind of tyranny that it sets up. You couldn't make a piece like this from a photograph, because I've actually taken a very wide, this is a 180-degree view of a landscape, and I've compressed it. I pushed it in like this in order to make it not so long and narrow. Both things are a photograph has a use, but you have to be careful it doesn't dictate everything to you.
And here's the painting.
Yes. Again, about 16 feet long, and in some ways less confusing or less busy than the sketch, and full of, enough information about what's there that when people who live in Vancouver see the painting, they go, oh, I live right there, or my aunt lives right there. But what they're pointing at is really just a glob of paint. When you get in close, it's not that well defined, but there's enough information in the painting that they can locate where things are from there. So they bring their own memory of the place to it. and then fill in all the rest.
Sorry.
They're like saying, I know exactly what's here, but they don't know exactly what's there because of the painting. They know what's exactly there because of their experience of the place.
That's amazing. Okay, so let's just look through these. New York City.
From the Empire State Building.
From the Empire State Building. Oh. How do you give yourself permission to, like, oh, I rented a tugboat. Oh, I went up in a plane. For me, an inner voice would say, artists don't do that, or painters don't do that, or who does that? Or, I mean,
I'm just driven by, like, I know the information I need, and I'm trying to figure out how I can get it.
Right.
And so I just, I phone friends and say, do you know anybody who's got an office in Citibank building up above the 40th floor?
Wow.
And they'll, I might phone one or two people, and I finally find somebody who says, yes, so-and-so's got an office there. Or I know somebody who has an office there. And then I phone them, or I go in the building and press the top floor on the elevator and get out and see if I can talk my way into an office. Again, looking south with the Hudson River on one side and the East River on the other in New York.
And you also walk around in the city a lot as well at ground level.
Yes.
Is that true? Sorry, that was too fast.
So from the air, the paintings take the noise and the smell and all that part away from the city like New York. But when you're there, you're overwhelmed by all of this chaos of sense that's coming into your senses. So I want to somehow get that back into the paintings, which I try to do with the handling of the paint. And that's painting.
Mind-blowing.
Yeah, it was a fun thing to do, but it was complex. I actually left out about 4 or 5 avenues in the center of north-south avenues in the center of Manhattan in order to get everything kind of squeezed in.
That's a great, it's interesting because, knowing what to eliminate, I bet nobody comes up to you and says, where's the other avenue?
No, they don't. They just
exactly what it is.
Well, I haven't had that experience, but I try to put the key things in. I've got Broadway comes down diagonally and intersects the other avenues. And that's the avenue in the center. So that's a key one to have in. And, the Flatiron building where it, crosses another street and there's a kind of Y in the two. Mm-hmm. And then downtown area and the wharves, the 3 bridges on the East River side, those are all crucial things to have in. And those allow people to kind of orient themselves.
Okay, here's a pastel of New York. Another kind of reference material.
Yes, photograph with a watercolor added on the bottom.
And that painting of New York.
Yes.
And I think that is the end of our, oh no, one more, my favorite for some reason.
View of Lower Manhattan from the New Jersey side.
Yeah, just amazing.
So these are street views in Toronto, small 10 by 12 inch paintings on birch panels.
How often do you get a chance to do something like this?
Well, I did it in a period of time in around 2010, I think. But I tend to do work outdoors all the time, but sometimes that means once a month, and other times it means every day for a month. It just depends.
They're so beautiful. I know people will admire the very juicy paint and the wet into wet application, which you've already talked about somewhat.
Well, they were fun to do.
I'll bet. How do you approach something like this? I mean, you just set up on the street corner in Toronto, right?
Well, in some cases I can. Other times I have to take a photograph. Some places you just can't set up. It's just too busy and too strange. But I have a pickup truck, and I just sort of have the gear in the back of the bed, and so if I can park the car and just flip down the tailgate then I can stand there and I'm not blocking the sidewalk, or and I don't have as many curious passerbys.
Yes.
But sometimes it's just not possible, so I take a photograph.
And these follow the same, do these follow the same sort of way of painting that you talked about earlier?
Exactly the same. Sketch it in red paint and then fill it in.
So beautiful.
And that's a little bit bigger. That's about a 20 by 20 inch panel.
I think one might, I think sometimes people are afraid to paint things like all the street lights, the poles, but you can see how beautifully that makes the painting. Or maybe, I mean, maybe you could talk about how do you decide where to stop and do the painting?
Well, these are very specific. These are streets in Toronto that only have two-story buildings that where the facades cover a long period of time, from sort of 60s to the present day.
Wow.
There's a lot of infrastructure on the street, so generally a streetcar line. So you've got all of these wires moving every which way, along with the hydro wires and the lamp posts. And I will say that in that I was influenced by the cartoonist J.R. Crumb, the Californian guy who did those kind of 1960s things. And he did a lot of sketches of that kind of urban infrastructure, of just what does a pole with a hydro transformer on it look like. And I do remember looking at those very carefully, thinking, gee, he's seen something that nobody else has seen and bothered with.
Yeah. They're just so lovely. And
again, it's that sort of low light that you get from October to April, where the sun comes in obliquely and throws really strong, hard shadows.
I'll go through this series. I picked a city series and then a home series.
That's my gardens, perennial beds and vegetable beds. And my wife was very ambitious at one point and planted a magnolia tree. Well, she planted many and finally found one that actually survived the winters. So every year at exactly this time, it comes into bloom, and they're pretty magnificent. And that's a reverse view looking back at my studio building with a big red oriental poppy in the foreground.
Are these, sorry.
It's a Siberian iris I have, which are this incredibly beautiful, deep purpley blue with hardly any other markings on them. And every year I see them and I want to paint them, and I never get it exactly how I see. So every year they come into bloom and I look at them again. I said, I'll try it again. And they bloom at the same time as the early poppies. So you get this lovely red happening behind it with the poppies.
Beautiful.
And that's a daffodil. It's a little bit earlier in the year, again, in the corner of my porch in my neighbor's house. And that's a wild iris that grows up on the shoreline of Georgian Bay. So that's the kind of a wildflower.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about your current series that's on touring around Canada right now.
Yeah, so that's a portrait of the writer David McFarland, who's from Hamilton. He was in my studio. I had painted a series of portraits of people that live in and around Georgian Bay, where the portrait is smaller than you would normally do and the landscape is bigger than you would normally do in terms of where things are in the composition. And I thought David would want to be depicted on Georgian Bay, where he spent many of his summers. And he said, no, he wanted Hamilton as the background. So I photographed him in my studio. I photographed him with the light coming both ways, from left and from right. And then I went down to Hamilton, and his mother had just passed away. And he and his brother and sister were clearing out the family home, which is just under the mountain. near sort of where Queen Street would run into the mountain kind of thing. And so he took me on a tour of the property, the neighborhood, up the escarpment, sort of told me about the first time he dropped acid up on the escarpment. And so again, I took all the different photographs I'd made, sketches I'd made. You can see the background area above his head is actually very similar to one of the sketches that you reproduced of the view from Concession Street on the mountain. So I used all this resource material that I'd collected over the years for the landscape part of it. And his family had this gigantic pool in the background, which was the basis of a novel he wrote, and also where he would go to write his novels. He would sit beside the pool with a typewriter and do a lot of his writing there. And that was painted in 2014, and it was that painting that gave me the idea of approaching a bunch of Canadian authors and saying, I'd like to paint your portrait, but I want to put it in a place in the landscape that's very important to you. And then I'd like you to write about the place. And we're going to make an exhibition of all this.
Wow.
And 45 of them said yes.
That's so amazing. So this is such a formally challenging painting. Like,
yes,
to combine two things like this and make it work as a painting would be very, very challenging. Anything you learned during this?
Yes, I learned that I started off trying to figure, the head will block out crucial parts of the landscape. So I was always trying to figure out how to not have crucial parts of the landscape behind a person's head. And then after about painting 4 or 5 of them, I realized I could just treat the landscape like it had a zipper in it and unzip it up to the person's head and then just pull the 2 sides out. So what's immediately on his left cheek and right cheek actually join up. I've just made the space behind his head empty of anything important. Yeah. Once I realized that, then the problem of finding how to integrate the 2 became much easier. But I would collect the information separately, but I'd have to have the same light on the person as I had on the landscape. It'd have to be coming from the same direction. And so I generally photograph the artist in my studio or in some location where I had strong natural light coming in from one side, and then I reversed the position they were sitting in and had it coming from the other side. And I shot them against a white wall. And then I just outputted the photographs on a sheet of, 8.5 by 11 paper and drew the landscape in with a Sharpie. Just a black pen. And that's how I would come up with the composition.
Wow. It's amazing. So many of them said yes.
Yes, it is, because I'm not really like a society portrait painter. I didn't make them look younger than they are or better than they look.
How were they received? Let's say by the portrait subject.
Well, about 6 of the people really liked them, and about 6 of the people really hated them, and the rest, I think, were surprised and a little bit perplexed by how I made them look, but they were okay with it.
So a project like this must have taken you years.
Well, it did. It did, but I did the bulk of the research in 2015 and 16, 16 and 17, and did most of the paintings in 18, 19, and early 2020. So I really had to work harder and more in a more focused way. And I had to organize a lot of logistics. So when I went to Newfoundland, I saw 6 authors all in one fell swoop.
Wow.
And then I managed to get to the landscapes they all wanted, except for one of them in that one trip. And I did the same. I did a trip out west where I saw everybody that I was doing from Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC all in one month-long airplane hopping, car rental expedition, because nobody wanted to very few people wanted to be depicted in the place they lived. They wanted to be
Of course.
a place that they went to where they had a cottage or a summer place, or that was important to them in a more spiritual sense.
Yes.
So with like Thomas King who lives in Guelph, wanted to be painted in Tofino, like above Chesterman Beach. So I had to make a special trip out to Chesterman to document the landscape.
So in a huge series like this, which I assume once you've committed, you got to keep going.
Yes.
So how do you maintain, how do you maintain your energy, or did you ever sort of hit a roadblock, and how do you get over those kind of things?
Well, by the time I was on painting number 6 or 7, I had a museum that had agreed to have an exhibition and tour the exhibition. And by about painting 10, we had a book publisher who was on board with publishing a book. And then by about painting 15 or 16, we had the museums that wanted to be part of the tour. So at that point, there's no stopping. I can't say this isn't working. A massive amount of energy going into organizing all of this.
Yes.
So as my art dealer, Nicholas Metivier, said, you just put your head down for 4 years and never looked up.
Yikes. A tall order.
And that's David Adams Richards above the Miramichi River, where he was born and grown up. And the figures that exist in the space between he and the landscape are all associated with his writing, with what he sees as the roots of his writing, which are the question in Catholic theology about whether we operate, to what degree do our lives determined by free will or predetermination? An idea he traces back to St. Augustine. So you've got St. Augustine under his right elbow, sitting at a table. There's a Miramichi salmon to the left of St. Augustine. There's Job sitting on the dung heap under his wrist. And then in the right-hand side, there's Adam and Eve being expelled from paradise once again, and Satan falling from the sky like lightning, which is the title of a book he told me I had to read if I wanted to understand what all his books are about.
Oh my God.
Almost all his books, I felt like I sort of understood what they're about anyway, but I love the title of the book, so I put Satan falling upside down out of the sky. And when I approached the Miramichi, the day I was meeting him, a huge thunderstorm came in, and then it cleared off afterwards. So I sort of put that weather clearing event in the sky.
Okay, so Julie was asking if there is a brand of watercolor kit for painting outside that you might recommend, John.
Well, the little one is a Winsor Newton outdoor sketching kit. You might end up wanting to put your own pigments in, like just pull out the little dried cakes and get a blank and put the colors in that you want. Otherwise, I just use a plastic tray that's about 10 inches long and 4 inches wide that has big mixing areas and room for lots of pigment. 3 or 4 different kinds of brushes. And as I said earlier, the key thing is make it so you can get all set up in like 2 minutes and get to work. Don't have a complex outdoor sketching kit, either in watercolors or oils. The simpler you make it, the better.
Great. Next, Lisa.
Okay, that was actually very similar to advice that someone else gave in the comments. Hillary recommended the Winsor Newton one as well. Julie also asked, how do you market your work?
Well, I have one of the best art dealers in Canada who does a phenomenal job, but I would say you need to sort of be on top of things yourself. You have to use whatever exhibiting opportunities are available to you. And when you start off, that will be a coffee shop somewhere, and it will be your mom and dad and your brothers and sisters who come. And then you build your audience of people that are interested in your work out from that. But always look at all the different possibilities. There are public museums. There are places like the Carnegie Gallery in Dundas that are sort of artist-run type spaces. Use them all, whatever is appropriate at that time of your career, and accept the fact that just because something is your local exhibiting spot, they don't owe it to you to show your work. The person there deciding on what they want to show just may not like your work. And so you have to find your audience wherever it is, and that includes curators and dealers. There's no point in having an art dealer who doesn't like your work. Nothing will ever get sold. And there's no way that a curator who doesn't like your work will give you a show. So when somebody says they like your work, stay in touch with them, and be nice to all the junior people in all the organizations you meet, because they'll become the head of the organization eventually. And you should just be nice to them anyway, because that's that's the kind of person you should be. But there's a strategic value to it as well. A lot of the curators I know now, I met first when they were the schlepper, the person who received the paintings and moved them around. They were at the lowest level of the music of a given gallery, and but they were the person I had to deal with if I was bringing work in, delivering it, or picking it up. So just be nice to everybody.
Wonderful. I'm going to do a couple raised hands. You can either do it on your thing or just raise your hand in your screen. Anybody? Karen, are you raising your hand? No. Anybody else? You want to all put your questions in the chat? There's a few more questions in the chat that we could deal with.
Lois.
Yes, Lois. Sorry. Go ahead.
Where are the rest of the exhibitions besides in Woodstock? You said it were across Canada.
Well, the other part of the show is in Charlottetown right now. And then that will move, the part that's in Charlottetown will go to Corner Brook, to Sir Wilfrid Grenfell College Gallery in the fall. And then a small selection of the work will go to the Canadian High Commission Gallery in Trafalgar Square in London, England, in January, February, March of next year. And then the final exhibition will be in Sarnia, and that will be everything. That'll be, I think, all 45 paintings. And that will be, I think in the summer, June, July, August of 2023.
Thank you. That's why Woodstock's so close for us.
Yeah. I'm going to ask a quick question that some student wrote to me beforehand. With all that's happening in the world, do you think painting is still important? I mean, and how do we keep our belief in it going?
Well, there have been a lot of memos that painting is dead. They just forgot to send them all to me. I just kept painting. I don't think that I don't think it's painting's job to change the world. I think that painting that takes on social issues sometimes has a very limited lifespan, and there's nothing wrong with it. But I think a painting always has to let the viewer come in and exist in the space you've created and find their own meaning in it. So I don't think you want to try to direct the viewer from the point of view of meaning. I think you just want to provide a space that's enjoyable and fun for them to enter into, and that represents the world as you see it. All those other things, all those things that have to do with meaning, they'll enter into it anyway. They can't help but enter into it if you're making the painting and it's original to your way of seeing the world. But really, you just need to focus on making a good painting that's nice.
I
couldn't agree more.
Lois had your hand up.
Lois, yes.
Yeah.
John, I so much admire your work. I've seen it from your first show in 1993. At least that was the first time I saw your work.
Okay.
And I saw it in Newfoundland as well.
Yes.
in a couple of the galleries there, and quite different from what I saw at McMichael. But my question is, I didn't catch whether you're still working totally in oils on your big canvases. Did you just give up on acrylic altogether?
Yes, I only did it for like 3 or 4 months, and it just didn't work for me. I just didn't stick with it long enough to figure out what to do with it. What attracts me about acrylic still is that you can treat them like watercolor. You can paint them thinly better than you can paint oils. But I never spent enough time to figure out how to do that. So big paintings are all oil paintings. I still do lots of watercolors. I do fewer pastels now, just because it's so, it tends to make this, the studio ends up looking like an English mill town from 1950 with a layer of black dust on it.
It's very dangerous.
Yeah, and it's not overly healthy. And I do tons of sketching in watercolor and in small oil paintings and in pencil in sketchbooks. Your
pastel preparatory sketches are really, really wonderful. They're charming.
And pastel color is the most pure form. There's no medium. In other words, the thing that holds the pastel together disappears when you draw with it. So you've just got pure pigment on the page, and it's so luminous and so bright, and the color is just so rich that there's nothing that approaches it. The only thing I can think of are some kind of Northern European paintings that were enamel on, like done on copper plates or something. Those are, I still have the feeling looking at those that what I'm seeing is sort of what the artist saw, even though 500 years has intervened. But pastels, the real danger is they fall off the page. But other than that, nothing's going to change them.
I see 2 in the chat. Is it okay, Lisa, if one is Corinne, who asked about your blues. The Georgian Bay scenes with water and sky are extraordinary. The blues are astonishing, and I'd love to know how he works them. Any advice in that regard?
Yeah, if you want color to be strong, you just have to sacrifice everything else to that color.
Yes.
If you want blue to be really strong, you've got to have some kind of subtle reds and ochres to play it against, because that makes the blue seem stronger. And if you throw in a lot of other color, especially green, it'll sort of start to kill the blue. So you, like in some of those ones where the water is incredibly blue and so is the sky, everything else, the color and everything else has been played down in order to bring up the strength of the blue. And it's true with any color. If you look at a painting and you say, wow, that's amazing color, it probably has a limited palette. Not every color in the paint box thrown into it.
Here's another one. Do you ever paint? Thank you. I have actually a related question, but let's get to these. Do you ever paint plein air pieces over multiple days, or mostly wet and wet in one session?
No, always wet and wet. I'm just not really good at the other thing. I know lots of painters who are great at it and build their paintings on the basis of continued going back to it. And I may do that at some point, but I just have, the present hole I've dug for myself is starting to look very deep and hard to get out of.
Okay, I have 2 more here. As an artist, this is from Lori. As an artist, I have a huge aversion to accepting commissions. What is the process like for you? Do you have any advice in working this way? You already gave us some, but.
If you have a huge aversion to it, then don't do it. They're not that crucial. My advice is only do it for something you already do and know how to do. Part of doing a commission shouldn't really be learning a whole new technique or learning a whole new, like you shouldn't be, if somebody came to me and said, I'd like a piece of sculpture, you got the wrong guy. And I've actually had to tell people in the middle of some major commissions where a third party was brought in who should have been brought in the beginning and wasn't, but who did have a decision-making capacity. And they described something, and I said, if you want that, you've got the wrong artist. It's just, that's just not something I'm any good at. So you should be, and in fact, that commission went down the toilet.
Okay, here's does size matter when you're trying to exhibit? And I think that is something that plagues a lot of people, especially when your natural predilection is, or the size that feels right for you is small in your work.
Well, then stay there. I mean, I have a friend artist, a girl called Mara Korkala. She's about 10 or 15 years younger than me, no, probably more, probably 20. And she works, like that's the biggest size she works on. She does oil paintings and they're all on that size. She tried a few things bigger and she really didn't like it. So she's had a whole career making small objects. And that's fine. Her art dealer, who's also my art dealer. So do what you're comfortable with. Don't feel that you should be doing something for some other reason. Like work on the size that makes the best paintings for you.
What about, I have 2 more questions and then I think we'll let you go. Unless anyone, if you're desperate, put it in the chat right now or wave your hand at me. One is, how do you know, especially when you're starting out and you're starting to sell things, or if you have a show and you sell things, how do you not let what sells control your life and ruin your painting? or not ruin, but it seems to exercise an influence that is hard to get away from.
Well, it's not always that bad. I mean, it's possible that people like things and buy it because it's the best painting in the show. And maybe that's worthwhile looking at. But you can't really paint to that. You can't let that direct your paintings. And you only have to have tried it once or twice to realize it actually usually doesn't work. So the difficulty is that you can go on painting the same sort of thing for quite a while before the viewing public and the buying public realizes you've lost your interest. But eventually you will have lost your interest and the paintings it will be obvious to everybody that that's happened, because that extra little zing of energy just isn't there. And at that point, you need time to sort of let the work develop in new directions. And so the minute that you start getting bored with something, you should be casting about for where else the work might go, because it's going to take you 1 or 2 or 3 years to find that out. And you can paint similar type paintings or paint in that manner. In other words, I could keep painting city paintings for about 10 years, but after about year 8, it became obvious to me that this was going to end. So I started casting about. I could still do them and make great paintings for a couple more years, but the thrill had gone a bit for me. So don't keep on a track just because there's a demand for it. You'll lose part of, with the new group of things, whatever it is, you'll lose part of your audience, but if it's good work, you'll pick up a new part. And eventually, we're taught to think of artist trajectory as linear things because of art history. It's not. It's a series of elliptical orbits you do around some center. So eventually you're going to come back and intersect with one of those earlier orbits, and you're going to pick up a bunch of those people who lost interest because you went in a certain direction, and they'll come back on board and be interested again. So, just keep making the best work you can.
Okay, last question. Oh, wait, somebody asked, how do you get a dealer?
How do you
get a dealer?
Well, you have to be realistic. You're not going to get the best one in Canada just out of art school. Well, 1 or 2 people do, but that's really unusual. So you have to have a strong body of work and a bit of an exhibition history to get a good dealer. you have to ask around among the artists that they show whether or not they are a good dealer. And by that, I mean, it's not their public persona, it's do they pay you when they're supposed to? Are they charging you for things that aren't normal? Is it a fair division of the sale price in terms of the things they cover and the things you're expected to cover? And so you'll know that by asking your peers or asking artists that whose work they show. But you need a body of work. You have to have 10 or 15 great paintings where they can see the possibility of an exhibition, but they'll want to see the possibility of many exhibitions. So they want a sense that you're going to keep working and keep producing work that they're going to be happy to show. And that's a guess on their part, but they're going to base it on what they've seen. So they're going to look at your resume, and they're going to look at the work you've done, and they're going to look at the newest body of things that you send them. And you generally have to work your way up the food chain of galleries. And you should try to get as good a spot as you can with your home audience. So if I have a show in Toronto, I get 100 people coming to the opening. If I have a show in Munich, I get 20. I'm just not known there. I don't have friends and family there. I'm not part of the social fabric of the city. So it's, if you live in Dundas or Hamilton, you've got a group of possible places where you can show your work. Those would be the starting point. And then if none of them are interested, you look a little bit further afield.
Okay. I think we need to let you go. Much as I would love to talk to you forever. Can you unmute for a second, everybody, just for 1 second, Lisa, just so we can give John a huge round of applause, please. And he can hear it. Oh, I don't know if you hear anything. Okay, remute everybody.
Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody. I'm going to leave the meeting. So I hope it was worthwhile, and
God.
Keep painting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you
so much.
And thank you for your extreme generosity. Bye-bye now.
That was fun.